Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Delegate Corner. I'm your host, Sinkas, and today I have the pleasure of chatting with PaperImperium from GFX Labs. We discuss how he got into the space coming from an archaeologist background, and he has some very important insights to share based on his experience as a delegate in other protocols, including MakerDAO. Let's dive into what he has to say. All right, hello, PaperImperium, and welcome to Delegate Corner.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, glad to have you on the show. So I'd like to begin by learning a bit more about yourself, how you got in crypto, your background, things like that. So whenever you're ready, just take it away.
Sure. So I work for GFX Labs. I head the governance efforts for GFX. Before GFX, joining GFX, I was actually an archaeologist. I think it's pretty widely known. That's why my emblem is a trowel. So my previous career was a lot of dealing with regulators. I worked in the private sector as an archaeological consultant. So that has actually translated very well to crypto. I actually found crypto, I guess I got involved in DAOs and governance by in my personal portfolio. I'm attracted to value investments, things with high cash flow and low valuations. And at the time, this was very early 2021, things were still ramping up. Maker looked like a really good investment. So I bought some tokens, and I actually did not know what a DAO was at the time. A few months after having the tokens, I found the forum and got on there, started making some comments. Somebody was trying to do it's not important, some big proposal for like $5 million. And I was like, this is like, I think this is a dumb idea. And lo and behold, the vote shot it down. And I was like, oh, like this DAO thing is interesting. You can show up and say your piece in the public square. And, maybe you're a bit of a gadfly and annoying, but, people are like, well, he makes a good point and you can make your case. So that got me going down the DAO rabbit hole. And then this was before Maker had delegates or anything. Of course, I was not a whale. So the next set of things that I did was I started hosting Q&As with people in the traditional finance world or the law or whatnot. So I brought several speakers to talk to the DAO and have the DAO talk to them to kind of get to know each other. So like a senior vice president from the Federal Reserve, some business school professors who had written some books about DeFi, a congressman on the Financial Services Committee, stuff like that. I've always been very big on educational outreach, and that goes in both directions. We need education, and other people need education about crypto and DeFi. So, and then Maker instituted delegation, and I set all that aside and focused on delegation, and very quickly went in-house with GFX because it was formed around that time, and one of the founders was very involved at Compound and Uniswap. So with my experience at Maker, we're like, well, this is a very strong governance resume, right? Uniswap, Compound, Maker. These are like three of the four like backbone protocols of DeFi at the time. So and now the rest is history, and we are large delegates on. We're mostly known for our work at Maker, Uniswap, and now Optimism, where we are large delegates and also sit on the Grants Council currently.
Amazing. I think it's fascinating. I've had other guests on the podcast, and mostly their background is relevant to the tech industry. So it's amazing to see an ex-archaeologist join the space. So yeah, really exciting to see. And what are your interests in the space? You mentioned you got like through value investment and you saw Maker, but what do you see kind of like your area of expertise other than governance or and DAOs? Is it like NFTs or crypto, like cryptocurrency? What do you think is the most
Oh,
exciting?
I can talk people's ears off about stable coins. I'm a stablecoin nerd. I love them. I love learning about new ones. This has been a really exciting year because a lot of new ones have come to market after last year was kind of consolidation, or the first half of the year. There were stable coins dropping out of the race, and now we've got new fiat-backed ones at Hong Kong and Singapore. We've got some very exotically structured ones that we'll see how they do based on delta neutral hedging strategies and some other interesting ones. And I I try to actually run down all the founders and be like, tell me about your project. I just want to know how it worked and what you want to do with it. So stable coins. I'm also very deep in the real world asset space, mostly because I've had the opportunity to have a front row seat at Maker from the very beginning of that, onboarding of the very first one to now. Also means that I'm very well, I monitor and or talk with the folks at other real world asset platforms quite a bit. So I have seen a lot of the successes and heartaches of real world assets. And I will say the space is moving forward, but it's still a very challenging area. But I do think there's great potential. So stablecoins, real world assets, and then public policy. I'm not a lobbyist, but I do try to make myself available to regulators and lawmakers and researchers and student groups and media if someone has questions. I don't advocate for specific outcomes, but I do truthfully give my opinion if asked, for things like commentary on legislation, or if a researcher at, say, a central bank or a commercial bank is looking for a data set, or a ratings agency wants to know how something works. I have an open door policy. I take every call.
Mhm. Amazing. It's pretty interesting that, in the world of, Bored Apes and Shiba Inu and things like that, which are like exciting and new and innovative, it's actually quite refreshing to see people like interested in stable coins, which I think a lot of people in the industry regard as boring, but at the same time, they are, in my opinion, underappreciated in terms of their importance to the space. So that's pretty neat. And what brought you or GFX Labs in general to Optimism? You didn't mention you were in Maker and Uniswap, but what caused GFX Labs' interest in Optimism?
Right. So most people know GFX Labs for our governance work. Most of what GFX Labs does is actually development work, its own products or contracted for other people. So we tend to have a very, of the professional governance outfits, we're not like, say, Flipside or Stable Lab or Wallfacer or some Seed Latam or some of these other professional or semi-professional groups that have started to form, which I think is wonderful for the space. We operate a little bit differently. Because it's mostly just me, and I am supported by part-time by a bunch of legal, technical, financial staff. But when it comes to monitoring things, it's mostly me. So we're pretty picky about where we go, and we have a policy of only taking delegations in one protocol within a vertical, unless we feel that they are not competitors. So one borrow lend, one DEX. In the case of layer twos, we actually do hold a delegation over at Arbitrum. It's not nearly as big as our delegation at Optimism, but we don't really feel that they compete. We think this is a duopoly market kind of, and that there's basically, these are different ecosystems that will basically dominate together, and the stability of one will also help stabilize the other. So in the case of Optimism, we were invited, GFX Labs, because we don't tend to just show up at every protocol and hang out a shingle and ask for delegation. We tend to have close relationships with a small number of large delegators. So we generally only show up when we're invited. Our current activity is limited to Optimism, Arbitrum, 0x, Uniswap. We are also still active at MakerDAO, though the delegation landscape is very different over there right now. So things are in flux, and we'll just set that to the side. But those are the 5 protocols we're mostly involved with for governance work.
Mm-hmm. All right. And you mentioned you were kind of like the only person really on the monitor side, but you do work with the rest of the team on the legal stuff or technicals. Could you tell me a little bit more about how you tackle like GFX Labs duties as a delegate, like when it comes to reviewing proposals or to deciding or submitting your own proposals? How do you tackle that kind of work?
Yeah, so I mean, I start my day with basically an hour to an hour and a half of reading emails and forum posts. So that's kind of like how I start my day. I do a little bit while I have my coffee, and then after I drop the kids off, I do the rest. So staying informed is a lot of the battle. Some protocols require more more detailed knowledge than others. You know, like for instance, MakerDAO is just incredibly complex because you have to know there's so many moving parts. Optimism has grown more complex. Arbitrum is beginning to develop a little more complexity. Uniswap is, you know, a very big protocol, but it's, you know, I would say there's fewer moving parts for governance to mess with. So there, you know, there's less to worry about. That's also the one that I'm not the primary lead for. And then, you know, a protocol like 0x is, you know, generally less, there's just less activity to monitor. But I would say that, you know, getting to know the people who either work at or work around or are counterparties to these DAO governances is a lot of what I do. So knowing who holds the tokens, who votes, who doesn't vote, who cares about this, that, or the other, that's a lot of my job, because a lot of times in DAOs there's not a lot of diligence. So knowing part of that is knowing who is bringing a proposal, who benefits from a proposal, and who doesn't. And then once you have that, then you can look at the proposal itself and try to evaluate it on its merits. Depending on the proposal, this usually involves a review of the counterparties, if you know who they are, the proposer, if you know who they are, and you know, if there's a track record, like it's a repeat budget request or a, you know, second time asking for a grant, or the, you know, some election, then you can refer back to people's history. So just keeping track of all that's mostly what I do. I actually have come to enjoy the boring aspects like that, because sometimes, as we all know, DAOs can be a little dramatic.
Yeah, they definitely can. And yeah, I've heard from other people as well that like keeping up with the space in general, but specifically for DAOs and protocols as well, is like a full-time job. And I find myself in more like similar situation where I keep track of conversation happening on Optimism and some other protocols. And at some point, it can be, you know, a lot of work to just keep on top of everything and be engaged with all the conversation happening. And some others have agreed that this is one of the most challenging things to do as a delegate, like remain informed. What would you say is the most challenging thing as a delegate?
I mean, there's a lot. The trouble is you get informed and then you take a vacation, you come back, and you're not informed anymore. So a lot of information becomes stale very quickly. I think is on a lot of protocols and on a lot of issues, this is just a space that moves very quickly. And the people in it also move very quickly. So it's even I who do this full time, I struggle not to be caught off sides by some proposals or some events. A big thing in DAOs is the diffusion of responsibility, right? This is like, if something goes wrong with some aspect of a proposal or the protocol, there's not necessarily someone you can point at and say it's your fault, right? And so as a consequence, there's no one that's incentivized to avoid being pointed at and saying this is your fault. So they're trying to figure out where there's not someone explicitly in charge. Those are usually the places you need to stay informed the most. Even if you think whoever's in charge of something is not doing a good job or whatnot, if there's someone who's very explicitly in charge, or they're the ones that is gonna catch the blame, it's probably more fruitful to spend your time, because we all have limited hours. We all have the same endowment of 24 hours a day. You got to sleep for at least 3 or 4 of those. Look, I would say when you're trying to be informed, you're never going to be informed completely. Try to pick the areas that you think no one else is paying attention is I guess what I would say. So a good example of this that's not me is over on Optimism is Jack Anorak has done a lot of work trying to follow up on how some of the early grants were spent, without commenting on the specifics of the things that he has found or thinks he's found or reported. That's exactly the kind of thing because that was pre-grants council. There was no one in charge of following up on this stuff. That's exactly the kind of stuff that you want to see delegates doing and being proactive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely agree. And what would you say are some of the best practices as a delegate to either keep informed or, communicate with your constituents and people in the community regarding your reasoning, rationale, how you decide how to vote? What are some of the like practical things that you can do as a delegate to make sure that you're kind of like doing your job properly, if that makes sense?
Try to catch things early, I guess, when there's something that's going wrong. I think it's quite fine to be very stern with people because there's not enough of that in this space. There's a lot of hand waving, oh, it's only $1 million, only $100,000 or something like that, that's stupid. We'll be quite honest. People should treat it like their own money, or at least how they imagine they would treat their own money. However, when you find something wrong, it's best to try to find it early and then figure out how not to do it again or how to fix it. So I think a lot of people say there's too much criticism in DAOs. I think it's fine to criticize. I think there's not enough serious criticism. There's a lot of like ad hominem stuff, which is no good for anybody. But if something looks wrong or you think something's being not done correctly, I think it's absolutely fine to point it out. But I think you also need to take the time to say why and what you think should be done about it, right? I think it's not helpful to say, well, you're wasting a bunch of money on this budget, right? You should say, you know, how are they wasting it in your opinion? And, what should they do differently? And even if they don't agree with your particular, like what can you put in systematically to like lower the odds of there being waste or whatever the issue is, again in the future. A lot of times this comes back to just transparency or making people own a problem, right? This goes back to the diffusion of responsibility. DAOs are decentralized. It's very flat hierarchy. That's wonderful. But it also means that a lot of times there's just no one that is on the hook. And so there's no one incentivized to avoid problems.
Mhm. Yeah, interesting perspective. I would say that, like, my opinion would be that it's a lot of like DAOs have a lot of people pleasing and not as much criticism, whereas you do kind of like suggest the opposite. But I think, yeah, it's like one thing to just criticize something and say, "Oh, this is stupid, this doesn't work," or whatever, and it's completely different thing to say, "This doesn't work. Here's a different approach that would make more sense." And I think we need more of that. We need solutions rather than pointing out somebody's else solution doesn't work. So that's my idea as well, and that's what I want to hopefully do more of is propose solutions if I see something that doesn't work.
And I want to say that I think Optimism governance has been a really good example of best practice here. It was like, I got to be honest, it was a dumpster fire when it started. We've been here since the beginning. Like it made me think that Maker was fun, right? Like but it has come so far, and it was by taking baby steps and iterating. Things would not work well, so they would try something else. They'd be like, okay, well, do a couple months of something, try it out, and well, here's what we're going to do to try to iterate. And I think Optimism is one of the least dysfunctional governances. It is the best governance that I am active in right now.
Mhm.
And I think that's because, and it didn't start that way. It has come a long way. And it's because, fix the problem, not the blame. I mean, sometimes there's room for blame, but like, find this isn't working. We wasted a bunch of money, or like people are just yelling at each other on the forums, or whatever it is, and then trying to improve upon it. And sometimes those improvements are a step backwards and you undo them. But Optimism has been a really good example of this, of people make mistakes. I make lots of mistakes. Everybody makes it. Sometimes they're expensive mistakes. I try not to make expensive mistakes, but I've seen some very expensive mistakes. Mistakes are part of learning.
Mhm.
Right. So, I think that's the key here is it's important to identify the mistakes and then learn from them. And I think you can't learn from them if you don't identify them. I think there's not enough identifying the mistakes sometimes. But then, as you said, like making the criticism a little bit more constructive is what separates a merely vigilant delegate from like a really good delegate.
Mhm. Yeah, very interesting insights. And speaking of like governance in general, like on Optimism, I do agree with you that we'll kind of like it's a great example of learning by mistakes, or taking previous experiences and learning from that. We saw that in retroactive public goods funding and kind of like the analysis that was done on round one and round two. And I love the idea of kind of like experimenting, then taking kind of like what happened as feedback and iterating the next version. But in general, like as I'm kind of like taking a step back and seeing the whole picture, what would you say are things we are strong at, or things that we are lacking, things that we could experiment more with? What's your overall stance, either you personally or like GFX's labs stance on Optimism's governance?
Right. So I think one of the things Optimism does really well is continue to engage a very wide base of stakeholders, and that is, I think, only going to grow with the super chain concept. I think for bringing in both new whales and new smallholders and just activists and advocates, I think Optimism has done a really good job. This has led to a lot of dispersion of power, and because while it does have some very concentrated large voters, and we're one of them, it also means that there's competing large voters, right? Because one whale or two whales is a big problem. 10 or 12 whales is less of a problem because they probably don't all see eye to eye on everything. And so they have competing, blocks of votes. And also having, thousand, I mean, there's like 4,000 addresses that delegate to us alone. That, and then you look at like, I think having the citizen house and just in general, the high level of activity by actual community. I don't use that word lightly. I don't think most places have much community. A lot of places probably don't need much community. And L2, I think it's very good. But it means a lot of diverse views are expressed, and I think a lot of them are dumb, but I think a lot of them are great. And that lets a 1,000 ideas bloom, I guess, and you pick the ones that are the prettiest. So I think Optimism has done really well at that, better than most protocol. I think most protocols would give their front teeth to be able to say they have 2,000 people that check the forum once a month and make a comment on Discord once a month, and 200 voters or what, regular, whatever it is. I don't know what the actual statistics are. I think an area where Optimism could really improve, and I think they have acknowledged that they need to improve on this, is they need to do more for decentralization of the actual, like the mechanical decentralization. Like for instance, Arbitrum token holders, they ultimately control like upgrades to the protocol. OP token doesn't actually control anything. It's still just kind of a counting, like a tallying mechanism to count votes. I think it's wonderful that we have now moved from token votes on snapshot to actual token votes on chain. I think that's a huge first step, that there's a governor contract and whatnot that's being used, but it can't execute code. And I don't know when we'll get to the point where the foundation is comfortable doing that. And I think perhaps I would love for them to turn over the keys today, rather than just count the votes and honor the votes. But perhaps certain powers can begin to be handed over, like moving tokens from the treasury or something like that, and then work up to the big ones, which would be protocol upgrades. So I would say that's the thing Optimism really needs to work on more, is the decentralization of the infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that end. I think it's important, and it's like some other protocols that have done that. You mentioned Arbitrum. On the one hand, it's it does raise some issues in terms of coordinating efforts and moving things along, but at the same time, it's actually decentralized, right? And it's in the hands of the community, so it's kind of like a battle between those two things.
Yeah, I mean, and I should be clear that I don't think decentralization is right for every project. I am generally pretty agnostic on it, but I think if your goal is to be decentralized, you should be making progress towards, regular progress towards that. I also think that decentralization has, it's a trade-off, right? It has pluses and minuses, but Optimism is becoming more mature. I think it has proven to have a very healthy governance ecosystem with a lot of competent people with different specialities. Um, you know, so I could not agree more with you.
Yeah. And in terms of specific initiatives that have happened in the Optimism collective or Optimism governance in general, like two come to mind very easily, like retroactive public goods funding, and then recently the missions in season four. What are some, experiments or initiatives that have happened that were successful or unsuccessful in your opinion, and why was that? And things we could do to improve them in your eyes or GFX Labs eyes.
Yeah, so for retroactive public goods funding and for missions outside the Grants Council, I'm actually going to punt on this one, simply for the fact that we like to be cognizant of the fact that we hold one of the seats in the Grants Council and are also ourselves a very large delegate. So we like to be mindful of that and like stay in our lane. We have opinions, but I don't think we want to necessarily get up on a soapbox and try to most of the time. There might be some exceptions, but I think most of the time we don't really want to try to influence Citizen House or these broader token house wide votes. We have opinions and we'll state them on our delegate communication thread, or if someone specifically asks us in private. But I don't think I think there's value in letting other people have some room to steer the conversation. So I'm going to punt on what on things that commenting on specific proposals outside the Grants Council.
Yeah, that's totally fair and respectable. So I'll move on and kind of like try to get your opinion on where you see the OP DAO 1 or 2 years from now, or where you would like to see it.
I mean, I think the big thing is I'd like to see the token actually have access to everything, and maybe we won't be there yet in 2 years. I really hope that we will be. I know there's some kind of legal questions that haven't been quite worked out, but I'm confident that the OP Foundation folks have some really bright people on the board. I'm confident they and their own legal team can figure something out. I also understand that it may be a little bit less of a priority right this second when they're trying to figure out how the super chain stuff's going to work and how those other chains are going to have relationships to Optimism. So I don't know when this will air, but just yesterday we had the announcement that Coinbase will be taking a fairly large OP stack and will be actively involved in Optimism governance, and in return Optimism will have certain rights to revenues and policies on the base chain. So we may have a lot of preoccupation with that, which I think is probably appropriate, because there's a window here to make a whole constellation of OP stack chains and figure out ways to interconnect them, which we have some ideas on that. Particularly, I think it would be really wonderful to have like an OP, like a super chain specific bridge, so that like if you have a token on one, it's not, you don't have to like go down to layer one and then back up to the other one. There are some fast like L2 to L2 options now, like Hot Protocol is a good example, but they're number one, they're liquidity constrained, and they're really only going to serve like very large assets like ETH. So if you have some small token, you really are stuck doing the dog leg, out the bridge for 7 days and then back up the other one. I think it'd be really great to have like an isolated intra super chain bridge. So like if I'm thinking of things other than governance, I'd really like to see, other than like decentralization of governance, I'd really like to see advancing governance to build out like more infrastructure to support, be like a carrot to get people to join the super chain, because I think it's a very strong concept.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I think that it's a very interesting announcement what happened yesterday with Waze. And like I'm keeping my eyes on it and trying to kind of like digest it and see like the implications that it have, especially in regards to the law of chains and how that plays out. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff happening, and definitely kind of like something to keep an eye on. All right, and going back to delegates basically, and because this podcast is about delegates after all, I would love to get your opinion on a delegate that hasn't received as much, voting power as they deserve based on their contribution. So if you have a delegate in mind that you have um, you've seen be very active and offer valuable contributions, but isn't as popular, now it's the time to give them a shout out.
Yeah, are you asking about delegates on Optimism specifically?
Yeah, on Optimism.
Um, yeah, let me think about this. So, the ones I used to name have have managed to get some delegation in the last few months. So, yeah, I mean, I want to give a thoughtful answer. My go-to answer would have been, someone like Jack Anorak or Pigov, or someone like that. But I think they've all picked up significant delegations in the last couple months. So, um, yeah,
Yeah, if
yeah.
nobody comes to mind right away, that's fine as well. I mean, that's one of the challenges that we have to solve, like these delegate discoverabilities, like having names, or people be more easy to discover and have their voices be heard. So that's something that's interesting. Like I personally have seen many delegates. Ricky's come to mind. Michael, blockchain guy who does the community call Optimus comes to mind as well. Like very active contributors, but not as big of a voting power. But that's awesome. And which delegate would you like to see on the podcast next? Like it doesn't have to be a small one; it could be anyone. But I would love, to get your opinion on who you'd like to see or listen to.
Yeah. Who would I like to see? That's I think I would, so I will confess I don't know who you've already had on. I think it would be really cool to see Linda Shi on, just because I find her, very thoughtful in her answers to things. She's also, I think, currently the largest delegate. So if you haven't had her, I think Matt, who represents Synthetics a lot, I think he would. I think he's just a colorful character and would be an entertaining guest. Just if you're, so I think he would be very strong in that regard. So, and then I'm trying to think. Oh, if you haven't had, have you had like someone like Crypto Chica or somebody from Seed Latam?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I've
if,
had Crypto Chica, Romina, and the plan is to get Joxes as well from Seed Island.
so those would have been my recommendations, but you may have already covered them.
All right, awesome. And is there an individual group or entity in the Optimus Collective? It could also be like an employee of the foundation, anyone really in the broader Optimus community that you would like to give a shout out to for their contributions to the space.
I'd like to thank Justine for just being very patient with delegates. She has to do a lot of the liaising with us, and you know, delegates. It's a political role, so we tend to be an irascible type. She's very patient, so I'd like to, I'm sure annoyed her many times. So I would just like to say thank you to her for being patient.
Yeah, absolutely. Justine is amazing with all the work she does on the collective. So yeah, shout out to Justine. All right, and to close things off, where are some places where somebody could learn more about GFX Labs, your actions as delegate? Maybe you have a delegate communication thread. Now it's your time to shill us everything basically.
Right. So on all of the protocols where we are active delegates, we maintain on the forum a thread. It's usually titled something like GFX Delegate Communication Thread. So whether it's on Optimism or on another protocol, you can find us that way. And that's where we lay out our voting history, a brief summary of each vote, and a brief summary of why we voted the way we did. Because we think it's important to have a record. Because if you ask me 6 months from now, why did you vote against or for something? I'm like, I don't know. But we do keep a record of all this stuff internally and publicly, so that I can then go back and say, oh well, here's why we thought this was a great idea. Which, hey, maybe it turned out not to be. You can be wrong. Also, I think more generally for delegates, if you're just a delegate on any protocol. I don't have an easy way to shill it on here, but I do just have like an informal Discord server for DeFi delegates on any protocol. They're welcome to join, so that delegates from different protocols can find each other and learn best and worst practices from each other. So that's another option. I'm also as I said at the beginning of the show, I have an open door policy. I don't think I've ever said no to anybody that's asked me to. I take a call with anyone that will not sue me, I guess. Unless you intend to sue me for something, some kind of enforcement agency, though I talk to many of them too, just for educational purposes when they have questions. So,
All right. If anybody
yeah.
wants to reach you for a call or whatever, where can they find you?
Yeah, so on Optimism Discord, you can probably find me under PaperImperium as my Discord handle. That's also my Twitter handle. I think I'm relatively easy to find. If people really can't find me, they could private message the GFX Labs handle on the forum of whatever protocol they're on.
All right, awesome. Yeah, and I'll have the links in the description for anybody interested, for anything that you mentioned. All right, well, Paper Imperium, thank you so much for being on the show. I really enjoyed our discussion. I think you had really great insights to share. So thanks again for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thanks for tuning in.